Our gospel today is a kind of showdown between Jesus and the devil, and it's a showdown that's been building for centuries since when our first reading took place. Our first reading was that story of Adam and Eve in the garden and the devil tempting them. And so there's a sort of parallel from that first story of Genesis to now this time of Jesus in the desert being tempted by the devil. And they run in parallel. The temptations even are quite the same. If you look closely at them, you can see that the devil doesn't really change how he approaches this work of temptation. And therefore, if you and I take a few minutes to look more closely, we can actually find a sort of a field guide to see how the devil, or the enemy of human nature, typically attempts to derail us, to discourage us, or to defeat us. And so what we can do this morning is to look at those three temptations that Jesus faces and understand them as symbolic for all the different kinds of temptation that you and I encounter, and hopefully in doing so to set the stage for our beginning of this Lenten season that we've now begun. And so the first temptation that Jesus encounters is a temptation that focuses on the body or the flesh. Some temptations focus on our physical appetites or our desires, like hunger. Jesus is tempted to turn the rock into bread. If you think back to Genesis, Adam and Eve were tempted to eat the fruit, seeing that it was good for food. But Jesus responds saying, "We do not live by bread alone." Essentially, this kind of temptation shows up whenever we think that we do not need God, when our physical desires are seen as all that matter. And this can come in a lot of different forms: an inordinate desire for money or for pleasure, for not giving any time to God, the desire to leave Mass early for convenience. This also includes lust or anger, impatience or resentment, the feeling that we want to get when we get impatient driving or want to signal to our fellow drivers, right? This is that temptation of the body or the flesh, things that we feel and then choose whether or not to act on. During Lent, we practice fasting and giving up meat to be attentive to this kind of temptation. Fasting helps us reorder our physical appetites so we don't become slaves to every desire we experience and ignore our need for God. Fasting helps us realize how strong these drives and feelings can be and gives us the opportunity to temper them. And so that's the first kind of temptation, the ones of the body or the flesh. A second temptation, Jesus is tempted to forsake God and to follow the devil instead in order to have power and influence. And Adam and Eve were tempted to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that they could decide for themselves what was good and what was evil. This is a temptation in its essence to forsake our own values, to cheat or to make our own rules, whether it's in faith or relationships or work or school or sports. This is a temptation to make our own way rather than to follow the Lord. In this category, maybe are also temptations to sell out for approval, to be unfaithful to our own relationships, to gossip or talk behind someone's back to gain the approval of those we admire, this desire for power and influence. And so this is a second kind of temptation that you and I can encounter. Finally, the third is some temptations which target not the body nor the mind, but instead the heart, the deepest part of ourselves. Jesus is tempted to throw himself off the parapet of the temple in order to force God to save him. And there's a great irony actually in this temptation if we look at it symbolically. I didn't know what a parapet was, so I looked it up. And a parapet is the protective wall at the edge of a roof. In other words, the parapet exists precisely in order to protect a person from falling. And so, in a way, the parapet is a symbol for how the Father is already caring for Jesus. And the devil is tempting him to rebel against that, to do exactly the opposite of what God is already doing for him. For Jesus to throw himself off the parapet would be to selfishly fight or rebel against the very design of the temple. And this is that third temptation for you and I, that at times you and I are tempted to rebel against the very architecture of the temple. That is, the way that God works, the way that God has made us and has made the world around us. We're tempted to be selfish or rebel against the church or God's commandments, temptations to be obstinate toward God, or even to resist his grace as he seeks to help us and we push him away. It's really interesting to note how the devil tempts Jesus with this by first throwing Jesus' identity into question. He begins, "If you are the Son of God." he invites Jesus to doubt the Father's love and care for him. He cuts at the very identity of who Jesus is. And if you notice, this is the very same temptation the devil had used previously with Adam and Eve, all those centuries previous. He tempted them to believe that God was holding out on them, that the Lord was somehow manipulating them, or he did not actually care for them. And this is a temptation that you and I also encounter. We're tempted to doubt our identity or God's love for us. We can be tempted in many ways to believe that God does not care for us, that we are not good enough for him, or that we are forgotten by him. And this is, I think, the most common but also the most dangerous temptation of all, worse than any temptation of the flesh, because this attacks the very heart of our relationship with God, which is the source of grace to overcome all sins and all temptations. This message is one to discouragement or despair. And sometimes this temptation can pose as a sort of realism or honesty, but in fact it's a lie and often leads us to self-pity, to interior sadness, to this sense of discouragement and despair. It attacks the very heart of who we are. Today we celebrate, and this is kind of a side note that connects back in, but today we celebrate the rite of sending. Our catechumens who are in OCIA are being sent to the rite of election that's going to take place at the cathedral this afternoon. And the rite of election is all about God's personal care for us, the fact that he calls us by name, working in our hearts and lives to draw us closer to him. Each of our catechumens and our candidates have experienced this call of God personally, this fact that the Lord has a personal relationship. And so catechumens and candidates, your presence here reminds us that God calls each and every person here by name, that he inspires us to trust our belonging to him and resist the temptation to doubt his providential care. And so your presence here is a witness against this temptation, this lie of the enemy that cuts at our very heart. And so thank you for your presence here today. And so those are our three temptations. And to be honest, you and I are probably just like Adam and Eve. We fall prey to them at different times, but Jesus does not. And that's the point of that second reading, which Paul in the Romans, it's a complicated reading. It might be hard to follow those words of Paul, but he's setting up again this same parallel between Adam and Eve and Jesus. And this is the point that Paul is making. He says, through the transgression of one, condemnation came upon all, but through one righteous act, acquittal and life came to all. In other words, where we fall short, Jesus has succeeded. His saving work has been victorious, and we get to share in the grace that he has merited. And so this is the basis for our hope, that by facing these temptations, Jesus has given us and continues to give us the grace to recognize the attacks of the enemy, to resist them, and to experience his saving power. And so as we begin this season of Lent, as we begin this journey of 40 days, we're challenged and invited to pray and ask God for his grace, for his help. I mentioned on Ash Wednesday a sort of life hack for Lent, so to speak, that you and I should begin every day asking God for his grace, praying, Lord, give me the grace to be faithful today to my Lenten practices, whatever maybe you're giving up or trying to do for Lent, your prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. It's essential that we ask God for his grace. It's not about our own efforts on our own, but about learning to rely on the Lord. And so each day we should ask for God's grace. And we can pray, Jesus, give me the grace to embrace this Lenten season with courage and with hope. Help me to trust that your grace will help me to recognize and resist the many distractions and temptations of the evil one. And give me the grace to know that you are at work, transforming and redeeming my heart, even in my failures. Help me continually resolve to be faithful to you. Amen.